Hi there and welcome back to my channel. My name is Fallon and today I'm going to be talking about something that kind of is controversial, maybe not controversial, but something that not everyone will agree on in the quilting world, and that is starching my fabric. So I've kind of evolved on how I prepare my fabric for quilting, and I think probably any quilter will say that that is the same for them as well, because you're kind of finding what works for you, in my opinion. It's kind of like if you ask somebody in a group on maybe Facebook for quilting, do you pre-wash your fabric? You'll see thousands of comments in there because some people like to pre-wash, some people don't, and everybody feels like their way of doing it is the right way. Well, maybe not everybody. I just kind of don't read them because I'm just not going to ever pre-wash my fabric. It's just not a step I'm ever going to take. But I think starching is kind of the same thing, just like pressing seams open or pressing to the side. Everybody's gonna think a different way on that. So with starching my fabric, I really only starch yardage. If it's a pre-cut, I only starch it if I'm going to be using it for quilt as you go, because you're going to press the seam over, and I like it to be a little more stiff so that it's a lot easier to just finger press and move on with the next strip. So starching, it's really interesting because when I first started quilting, I talk about this in another video where I had no idea what I was doing, and I just kind of, built on what was working and what wasn't. I didn't even iron or press my fabric when I first started. I was just like, this isn't a step I want to take. I don't even iron my clothes. I hate to iron. I'm not going to do it. And nothing lined up properly, but I never really cared. I just liked how the whole quilt looked, and I didn't nitpick on seams meeting and everything. So as I grew with quilting and learned more, I started pressing my fabric. And then I kind of learned that I wasn't pressing my fabric, I was ironing it. So I wasn't getting as perfect blocks either. Then I learned about starching, and I would just kind of spray my fabric, iron it when it was still wet, and I actually think that works really well. It's kind of controversial in the fact that some people say you should let the starch dry all the way and before you iron. I don't think it's wrong to iron when it is wet or press or add heat to it, whatever. You're still gonna get fairly crisp fabric. So what I've decided is that with my yardage before cutting, I started getting it prepped. I would spray it with some starch and let it dry overnight. So say I'm up here working in my sewing room and I know what project I'm going to work on the next day. If it's yardage, I'll spray it before I go to bed and lay it out, let it dry, and have it ready for pressing in the morning. Now, if I'm working on something in the moment, like I feel like one of my blocks really needs to get starched, I'll spray it with my homemade starch and I'll press it while it's still wet, and it still gets fairly crisp. But I have found that if I spray this before going to bed, it gets a lot stiffer than if I spray it and iron right away, if that makes sense. What I've learned is that if you spray it and let the starch really seep into all the fibers of the fabric, you're gonna get a better, stiffer starch on it. If that's not what you want, then I would say go the quicker route and just spray it and iron it while it's still wet. I haven't had any issues with my iron getting gummed up doing it that way. I've received comments when people see me do it in videos that like, doesn't that gum up your iron? It hasn't for me. The only thing that gummed up my iron and got it all messy was if I use steam, and I quit using steam and adding water to my iron, and I don't have an issue anymore. So that's just for me. So what I've started doing with my fabric is I really like Best Press for if I really want a heavy starch on my fabric and am going to take the time to let it sit overnight. I really saturate my fabric, and so I'll open it up, and like with this being red, what I ended up getting was, if you see back here, something to lay it all out on. What I was doing was just laying it over my ironing station, and I would try to drape it all different. It was just getting too full, and especially if I had stuff I still wanted to work on while it dried, I just didn't have enough room, so I grabbed that off of Amazon. So what I do, let me turn, what I do is I'll just mist across my fabric really well. And with the Best Press, if it's misting really well, it gets, you know, it gets it pretty good and even. So I can kind of feel that it's nice and wet, but this is all just sitting on the surface. So if I iron it right now, I'll still feel the difference in the fabric. But I'm telling you, it is a huge difference if you wait. So I'm gonna put this one down here. I'll probably even it out when I'm not on video a little more. But I just do that with all of the fabric that I am going to be cutting and using. So I'll just get it all ready. And yes, I spray both sides just to make sure it gets nice and hopefully even and fully coated. Like kind of keep the white there away from the red because I don't want it to bleed onto it. And then I have the one more here that I'm going to spray. And once it dries, that's when I'm going to go in and press it. And I did mention that I used to iron my fabric instead of press it. It's still really hard for me to remember to press instead of iron because it's just kind of something that just feels so natural with me. With an iron is just ironing and using some pressure. So what I started doing to prevent myself from doing that, especially with yardage, is I started using my Cricut Easy Press. So let me grab that and show you why there's a difference. So with my Easy Press, and it is really dirty. Oh my gosh, how embarrassing. So with my Easy Press, the weight of it just doesn't make it where I want to move it around. I set it down and I hold it on the fabric, and it really has made a huge difference for my fabric to not end up all wonky after pressing. And because this has such even heat and I can set the temperature, I can set the timer, as I move across each section, it really gets everything nice and crisp and makes it so much easier for me to cut all of my pieces later. Once this fabric all dries, I'll show you how I use the Easy Press a little more close up on it so that you can see how the fabric looks. But I don't think it's necessary to use a press like that. If you don't have one, I wouldn't go out and get one just because I said I like how how it is. You can definitely use your iron to press. Just for me, because of how I work, and because I know with my iron on big pieces, I'm going to end up moving it and stretching the fabric, I found that the Easy Press works so much better for me. So I really like my fabric when I'm cutting from yardage to be really nice and starch. So just for good measure, sometimes I'll come over and I'll spray a little more on there. Like I said, this is not the only way to prep your fabric for sewing. You do not have to starch it all. You can just, you know, press your fabric, cut and go. You can do like I do sometimes and just spray it and press right away instead of waiting for it to dry. I don't believe there's any one way to really starch your fabric. This is just how I like to do it. So once this is all dry, I'll show you pressing it and we'll take a look at how the fabric looks versus doing it this way and versus doing it pressing while the starch is still wet on the fabric. All right, so my fabric is dry from the starch. So now I'm going to show you how I use my easy press to press the fabric. So I just kind of lay it down, press the timer. I have it set to 350 for cotton. It doesn't take much at all to really get it. I just leave it for a few seconds and move around on the fabric. I mean, with the even heat, it really presses quickly and it's so much faster than using my iron. I'm going to set this down because I'm going to move this side over where you can probably see where it was bundled up on the where I was laying it out to dry a little more. Sorry, I have my stand and everything here, so it doesn't, I can lay this flat across here a lot easier, but I'm kind of having to maneuver it a little bit. So here, just leave for a few seconds, maybe 5, and it just presses out all that bunching so fast. It is a lot nicer than using my iron and having to worry about, you know, me pressing and really getting some waves here in especially the end of the fabric. I folded that over. Well, it would probably get trimmed off anyway when I square it up, but hopefully you guys can see that, like how nicely that works. And then I'm just going to show you how I can finger press there and you can see the line from the starch and how nicely that, you know, you can get the starch to be for really letting it seep into the fibers of the fabric. So hopefully you can see how well that works for me doing it that way. I'm going to grab a fat quarter and I'm going to use my press since I already have it here and heated up, but you can kind of see since it's just coming from being folded, all of the creases and everything in it. And I just want to show you that I still think spraying the fabric and pressing it while wet can still work fine as well if you're in a hurry. So I usually, if I'm pressing, I spray just the reverse side, the back of the fabric, and then I press from the front. You can still feel that it's wet on this side. But I'm just gonna do the same thing, just do a few seconds. And I think it gets a little more crisp if I let it set, but I still think it works really well doing it this way as well if you're in a pinch. And just press it while it's wet. So you can still see my crease line, and you know, I still think the fabric is a little less, you know, it's a little more stiff than it was before doing it this way. So in my opinion, both ways work, but I feel like I get a little more crisp heavier starched fabric if I let it seep in than just spraying it quickly and doing it. But I really think both ways work pretty well. I really think what has helped me a lot is switching and using the Cricut Easy Press, because I don't get those waves at the end of my fabric anymore because I accidentally start ironing and moving the fabric and stretching it. So this has become my friend for not distorting my fabric. Well, hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But I really think for me, I have no issues with spraying my fabric and pressing it when wet, but I do feel like if you have the time and can wait, you get a little heavier starch if that's what you like, if you let it seep into the fibers. So that's my end thought on it. But I think, you know, if you have a way that is working for you, just go ahead and keep doing it that way. All right, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.